How can you compare it to a disease or to an economic problem or political problem? Nothing to compare. Please leave the word Holocaust for the Holocaust and nothing but it.
Today, I wish to take a few minutes to explain why the Jewish badges of the Nazi era, now retasked to buttress the arguments of anti-masker and anti-vaxxer advocates, is so incredibly offensive to many Canadians. I somehow hoped that this moment would never come on two levels. Having to explain something so basic, of course, is, well, kind of sad, but it's actually doubly tragic for another reason. Growing up as a child in rural Western Canada in the 70s and 80s, no one seemed to care a tinker's damn about the Holocaust, neither my social studies teacher nor anyone else in our tiny town. I prayed that if they ever did come to some realization about the centrality of the Holocaust in the history of the 20th century, that somehow others would take away the right lessons from it. From what I'm seeing at these protests across Canada and in Ottawa, it's essentially the worst of both worlds. They've finally taken notice of the Holocaust, but only because it appears on some surface level to support a really weak political position. At the current moment, no one seems to be getting it. Over and over, people are having to apologize for comparing the suffering of the Jews of Europe to perceived prejudice against those refusing to step up and take the jab. If your only takeaway from this photo is a visual justification for your wish to continue to go unvaccinated, you, sir or madam, have failed the citizenship course. Offensively bending and misappropriating history to the point that you have utterly and completely missed the point is not the same as a convincing argument. Part of being an adult is being able to put knowledge into context, and also sometimes conceding that you need to learn more. For the record, the collective memory of the destruction of European Jewry is not a means to an end, an all-purpose justification of whatever you need to argue that day. It is intensely painful for the survivors, like former Chief Rabbi Israel Meyer-Lau, whose family perished in the Holocaust except for an older brother, to have to see this over and over. Many survivors feared that after the war, people would simply forget about their suffering entirely. Today, it is truly painful to watch the protesters. They seem destined to always miss the point. It is offensive not because one fool is ignorant of history and its context, but rather because so many people, whole crowds of them, saw nothing particularly wrong with appropriating the suffering of actual victims. These misguided souls think that they are doing nothing wrong, faultless as always. But being tone deaf to the offense you are giving is not the same as not giving offense. This is how one survivor expressed his feelings on the matter.
When I see these comparisons, it's traumatic to hear that, because it really makes a mockery of my history. It makes a mockery of the Holocaust. It's an insult to the Holocaust. People were murdered for who they were. People were treated as cockroaches. So to at all compare the death of 6 million Jews, there is absolutely no comparison.
The yellow star is because I'm being viciously persecuted.
In the age of political correctness and trigger warnings and all the rest, this misappropriation so clearly crosses the line of decency, not to mention context, that the people involved should be deeply ashamed of themselves. And they actually do appear to be, but only once they are reproached and then inevitably have to walk back their hyperbolic nonsense. Why are so many people incapable of perceiving why this is offensive? Appropriating the imagery of the Holocaust for such crass political aims makes some of us wonder if our neighbors have lost their minds. We like to think that our country is sophisto and cool and totally gets it, but we do not. Keep in mind, Canadians fought and died in the Second World War, 45,000 of them, and helped the Allies liberate a number of occupied countries. Canadian soldiers, for example, helped liberate the transit ghetto Westerbork in the Netherlands in April 1945. Yet there's a kind of willful ignorance and obtuseness of those appropriating the Holocaust to buttress their arguments. And when they finally get called on their tone deafness, they can never accept at first that they're doing anything offensive. Then they apologize. Why not circumnavigate the inevitable and come up with a less hurtful analogy? Why is this so difficult? The people forced to wear the yellow star in the photos are actual humans who suffered and either died or were really never the same after surviving against great odds. What came next? Their deportation to a horror show, the like of which has never been seen before. Places like Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen. Well, you get the idea, not to mention the extermination camps, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and so forth. The people deported to these waking nightmares were true victims. In Montreal, no Vaxxer code means you can't get into the chapter's bookstore in Manulife Place. This is not the same as being deported from your own country to Poland to be murdered with poisonous gas. It's really not the same at all, if you think about it. I would argue that if you really can't understand this, then you're either being obtuse or you're being willfully ignorant of the facts of the Holocaust and why it matters. It is shocking that fellow citizens cannot see something so incredibly obvious. The opportunism and insensitivity toward fellow Canadians is so stunning that it's downright un-Canadian. Maybe we should aspire to a higher standard than just anything goes. Opportunism, in all its forms, is always painful to witness. Today it seems that the primary value of Holocaust memory is to deceive people into thinking that the anti-vaxxers are victims in the same manner as a child forced to wear the yellow star in Europe some 75 years ago. Why is it so infuriating? Insensitivity in all its forms is inherently vexing. Using the memories of the victims, those in those pictures, for your own purposes, it's just in poor taste. If only you could see yourself doing it. The yellow badge has nothing to do with vaccination. It was an ages-old method of identifying Jews so that they could be more easily persecuted. In Europe, badges to identify Jews date back to the 13th century. Eventually, it fell out of favor, and there is something like 200 years before the Nazis resurrected. At the end of the day, what happened under the Nazis was nothing short of mass murder and genocide perpetrated in the fog of total war. Today, refusing the vaccination does not leave anyone in the position of a Jewish man, woman, or child, say in Holland, starting in May 1942, when they made the yellow star mandatory for all citizens who were Jewish. The yellow star analogy is opportunistic at best and a total distortion of history at worst. The Nazi attempt to wipe out European Jewry without a trace is a tragedy almost without historical precedent. It is unfortunate that those with so little knowledge of history continue to try to use it for their own ends. They seem to think that context is irrelevant, but in truth, context is everything. Let's be clear. Legault has been far less than totally effective as Premier of Quebec in this crisis, and seems to have more belief in things like curfews than in actual science. If they don't need a curfew in Winnipeg, why do we need one in Montreal? I get it. He's filled with really bad, silly ideas. But he's not Hitler, and although Trudeau is a weak, vacillating force at 24 Sussex Drive and frequently a clown, he is absolutely not Stalin. This sign is made by someone who just doesn't get it, not remotely. There is an age-old axiom that a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Put it this way. No one who took a full semester undergraduate survey course on the Holocaust would ever make the unfortunate mistakes that these protesters are. Appropriating the symbols of another group's suffering is neither wise nor necessary. It is melodramatic, disrespectful of the survivors who remain, and demonstrates an abject disregard for history. Some protesters are repurposing the disaster which befell European Jewry to their own ends. Shame on those who insist on doing this. Having said that, most protesters are not anti-Semites. Some probably mean well, but they are going down a sad, rather strange road. Frankly, I'm not entirely unsympathetic to their anger and impatience with the COVID-19 status quo. It's understandable. However, their point of view would be so much better represented and so much more convincing if they appeared to know what they were talking about. They have needlessly marginalized and undermined their own political position. The protesters don't need the bull in the china shop routine to attract attention. Quite the contrary. They would be infinitely better off without demonstrating insensitivity to Holocaust survivors. It makes their movement seem churlish and ill-informed, trivializing the suffering of people who are actual victims of Nazi tyranny. Canadians and others deserve so much better. Thanks for listening. I would be interested in hearing any comments you might have on this topic. I will update again soon.
I'm a Holocaust survivor. When I see somebody on a COVID protest wearing a yellow star, I just can't understand what kind of a message they're trying to convey. The yellow star was a symbol of degrading the Jewish people. One of the steps in the development of the Holocaust process. The yellows